Okay, I will go back to the screen share. So the first thing that you have to do is that, in this case, because there are 3 possible cases, right? Not 2 possible cases. So the first thing that I have to do when I use the if statement, I will just make this a little bit bigger so that you guys can see it better. So when we go to the if statement, so this is the conditional statement, and the condition is actually provided in the cell K15, right? So if what the Excel shows in K15 is equal to expected. So in this case, because the condition is based on the text, not the number, we have to use the double quotation mark. So if K15 is expected, then that's the true statement, right? So if that logical test is met, we are going to use the value in N11, which is provided here, right? So we are going to use this value, right, 3.4 million. If that condition is not met, right, then we have 2 more options, right? So if the zirconium outlook is not equal to expected, then we have either optimistic or pessimistic, right? So instead of just simply typing in a number, I say I provided another if statement. So if K15 is optimistic, then we will use O11, which is 4.7 million, right? And the next one, which is the third possible case, right, is in M11. So I can either provide 3 different if statement, or I can just provide 2 different if statement, and because there is only 1 case left, I will just say if none of these conditions are met, use M11.
Okay, yeah, I tried doing 3 different if statements in one, and so I'll go back and do the 2 that you did.
Yeah, if you want to use the 3 different if statement, here what you have to do is just if another if, right? So if K15 is equal to pessimistic, right, then use M11.
Okay.
Right. Then you will need 1 more parenthesis because now we added 1 more statement.
Okay, thanks. No, the other question too was for financing. My question was why wouldn't you include the total payment, like which is the principal payment plus the interest payment? So why wouldn't cash flow from financing activities for year 1 be like an outflow of 1.728 million?
So the total payment is 1.728 million, right?
Right. So why wouldn't that be the outflow for year 1 under cash flow from financing? Why would you just include the principal for cash flow from financing?
The reason is because interest payment is already included in the cash flow from operation.
Okay.
Right. So the total payment can be divided into the interest payment and the reduction in the principal. And the interest payment shows up in the cash flow from operation or income statement because interest payment is tax exempt.
Okay.
Right. So that's the reason why.
And so to get the principal, would that just be, or to get the total payment, would that just be the payment function?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's exactly what you see here. So when you use the PMT function, you get the you actually get the amortization payment. So PMT function will give you the total payment, and you have to calculate out of that total payment how much is the interest payment and how much is the reduction in the principal. And the interest payment will show up in the income statement so that you can calculate how much tax you need to pay, right? And the rest, which is the reduction in the principal, will show up in the cash flow from financing. And this will not show up in the income statement because this is the stock variable, right? So what I'm saying is that when you look at the balance sheet, right? When you borrow $9 million, what will happen is that your long-term debt will go up by $9 million in your balance sheet, right? In year one, your long-term debt will decrease by $1 million. So these will show up in the balance sheet and not going to show up in the income statement. Was that answer to your question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? I think I saw some more questions from the chat. Oh yeah, I can do table analysis one more time. Right. So these are 4 different table analysis that I did, and these are actually just the copies. But so, in this case, we can do a table analysis with the regulation and without the regulation. But in this case right now, we are assuming that there is no regulation, right? So what you have to do is that first you have to set the possible variation of each variable, right? So in this case, this is the cost overrun. So cost overrun can be 0%, 10%, 15%. So these are the label of the table, right? And pessimistic, expected, optimistic, right? So when we use the table function, the first thing that we have to do is we select the table, right, including the labels, right? And go to data, what if analysis, data table, right? And now we have row input cell and the column input cell. And the variable at the top is the row variable, right? So row input cell should tell Excel, where these changes will take effect in the Excel. So I will click this cell, right? Because this is the text-based. So Excel will change the value, the text in cell K15 from expected to pessimistic or to optimistic. So Excel will change the value in cell K15 to the values of the labels in this table, right? And in case of the column input, so now we're talking about the cost overrun here. So the cost overrun is recorded in here, right? So Excel will change this value from 0% to 10% to 15%, right? And I saw some of you, then I press OK, then it will automatically fill in the table. Some of you actually tried to change these values directly, right? That's perfectly fine. So for example, some of you tried to change the revenue from 3.4 million to whatever value that is relevant, right? But in that case, what you want to do is you want these labels to be the number, not the text, because Excel will just, type in these values to that specific cell. So for example, when you highlight this and go to what if analysis and data table, right? And when you say row input cell is the revenue, right? Then it'll give you crazy number. And the column input cell is, so this was the cost overrun, right? So let's say this is here. So when I press enter, you will get the error message. The reason why you will get the error message is that when I use the table function this way, what the Excel will do is that Excel will put this pessimistic in this cell, right? So your revenue becomes not a number, revenue becomes a text, so your revenue is a pessimistic, then obviously Excel cannot calculate the net present value because all this Excel file will be destroyed. So that's the reason why you get the error message. Excel cannot calculate the value. Okay, so you have to make sure that there is a match between the information provided in the table and the information that is used in the designated cell. So in this case, because I used the text, right, I have to make sure that the text is used in the designated cell, so which is this one. Okay. No, not O15. K15. And the column input cell is this. Then press OK, then everything will be fine. Okay. Was that answer to your question, Max?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I was just having trouble with the inputs.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's the most common error. Any other questions about how to use the table function? Okay. Then can I move on to the simulation? Because none of you are showing your face, I feel like I'm talking to a wall. So if any of you are in a decent shape, please show your face. So I'm going to, thanks, Max, the simulation analysis. So, you know, I thought this was a great example for simulation analysis because there are so many moving parts in this case, right? So zirconium price can change, regulation can change, cost can overrun. So what happens when all of these changes happen at the same time, right? So to consider that possibility, the best way to do it is to introduce the simulation, right? But in case of the simulation, we cannot really use the drop-down menu because drop-down menu, the number of cases that we can cover is so limited. So instead of doing that, we provide a function for each variable. So in this case, I'm just saying that the zirconium price is a random variable. You don't know exactly what the price will be, but you know the distribution of that price. So here I'm saying that zirconium price has a normal distribution. Its price is, mean price is a $10,000 per ton, right? And the standard deviation is 1,500. So it can be any number between, say, 7,000 to 13,000. But the value that is close to 10,000 is more likely to happen, right? In case of regulation, I told you how we can actually generate a binary random variable using the if function. So what you can see here is I'm telling the Excel that first, I'm telling Excel to generate a random variable between 0 and 1. That's rand parenthesis, right? So Excel will generate any random variable, any random value between 0 and 1. And if that value is larger than 0.5, then it will become 1, right? If that random variable has a value that is less than 0.5, then that value becomes 0. So when I press enter, then this value will become either 0 or 1 with the equal probability, right? Hello. Come here. So my high school daughter is so bored. She decided to put on a show.
No.
And also she decided to take my class.
Bye.
Where are you going?
You're the one that told me to do this.
All right.
I didn't want to do this.
Oh, come on, you volunteered.
I didn't. You were like, well, you have to come. I told all my students you were gonna show up.
Okay. So the regulation can be either 0 or 1. And the same is true for the cost overrun. So in case of the cost overrun, we know that the value is between 0% and the 15%. So this is any number between 0 and 15%, and so on. So anyway, so when we do that, what the Excel will do is that Excel will randomly change these numbers according to the rule that I provided, right? Then what I can do is that because these numbers will randomly change, and each time the net present value will change, right? Depending on which value was selected in any of these variables, right? So whenever I press F9 here, you can see these numbers refresh, and you can see the net present value change each time, right? Then you may wonder, so what's the point? The point is now I can run a simulation. So I can press F9, say in this case, 3,000 different times, right? If you want to run 10,000 simulations, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't take a whole lot of time for you to run 10,000 simulations. Then what you can do is that you can actually calculate the mean value and the standard deviation and so on, right? So when these numbers, when you randomly draw these variables 3,000 times, what is the mean value of the net present value? So when you do that for 3,000 times, according to this simulation, mean net present value is 2 million. Standard deviation is 1.6 million. Maximum value out of that 3,000 simulation is 8 million. Minimum value is negative 3 million, right? And you can also calculate the probability for the net present value to be negative. And this is the function that you can use. So when you run 3,000 simulations, there's about 9 to 10% chance that this project will produce a negative net present value. Okay. Any questions about this? No? All right. How many of you have actually tried the simulation? Oh. All right. How many of you actually succeeded in running a simulation? No one? Okay, good, good. So let me go back to this one. So one of the students actually pointed out that out of these 4 variables, right, zirconium outlook, regulation, cost overrun, and mine design, the mine design actually is not a random variable, right? Because mine design is something that the company can choose, while all the other variables are things that the company cannot really control. So he thought that maybe we can run 2 separate cases for the current mine technology versus the cheaper mine technology. Because the question says that when you use the cheaper mine, it will reduce the initial cost, but it's going to increase the fixed cost in the future. And at the same time, because of the nature of the technology, the probability of the cost overrun will be 0. So what it means is that when we use the cheaper mine, we can eliminate one of the variables, right? So I decided to run 2 different simulations. So this is one with the current technology. So when we use the current technology, right, so we are eliminating the possibility of using the cheaper design, right? Then now we have only 3 variables, right? 3 variable is the zirconium price, regulation, and the cost overrun. And the basic setup is exactly the same. And this is basically the chart that shows the, NPV distribution. And again, the probability for the net present value to be negative is about 9%, 9.6%, about 10%. And obviously these numbers will change. But, no matter how many simulations that you run, you can see that this is somewhere between 9 and 10%. Okay. Then I run the same simulation, now using cheaper mine technology. So this value is always 1. So the company will use the cheaper mine, and because of that, the initial cost is 8.7 million. Fixed cost goes up, and also because of that, right? Now, cost overrun is always 0. Okay. Then what happens? So what happens is, now you can see the distribution difference between current design and the new design. So I kind of overimposed the distribution of new design to the distribution of older design. So whenever I press F9, these histograms will automatically update, right? But what you can actually see is that first, and I can show you the number. So this is the old design, the current design. And you can see that the mean net present value goes up, right? So the net present value will actually go up when you use the new design. In terms of the risk actually goes down, right? Because you eliminated the possibility of the cost overrun. And because of that, the probability for your net present value to be negative goes down from about 10% to 5 to 6%. And so when you visualize the data, the blue one is the distribution of net present value out of that 3,000 simulations. And the red one is the distribution of the net present value when you use the new cheaper mine technology. So you can see that the red one is better in a sense that there is a lower possibility of having a really low net present value, and there is a greater possibility of having a really high net present value compared to the current design. So these are the kind of things that you can do if you get used to the Monte Carlo simulations. Okay, any questions about this one? Nope. Okay. Anyone who wants to give it a try? Okay. All right, that's it for the mini case chapter 10. If you have any further questions, let me know. Otherwise, we are moving on to the chapter 11. So in chapter 11, so from now on, I think we have 5 classes left, including this one, right? So we will have to use 2 or 3 classes on this capital asset pricing model. And covering the capital asset pricing model in 2 or 3 classes is a little bit of tall task. So we may have to go a little bit faster than usual. And also I have to ask you to read the textbook really carefully. Okay. So what we're going to do now is that we will introduce the concept of the risk. We will talk about how to measure the risk. We will talk about how to measure the risk of a single asset versus the risk of a portfolio, right? And then we will talk about how the investors are supposed to make a decision when they invest in a portfolio, when there is a risky asset and a safe asset. Okay. And obviously we went over this a little bit in the financial markets class, right? So the first thing that we have learned is that risk and return are correlated in the market, and there is a reason why they are correlated. And also we will talk about exactly how they are correlated, right? So we will talk about how to measure the risk, how to measure the return, why they are correlated, and so on. And when you look at the market history of the different market indices, you can see the connections between the T-bills, bonds, and the equity, right? And this is the historical data. So you can see that, so basically this is the stock market, right? Stock market actually has higher rate of return. So had you invested $1 in 1900, right? In 2010, you will have more than $10,000 had you invested in stock. Had you invested in the bond, you will have only $191. Had you invested in T-bill, you will have only $74, right? Because of the compounding and because of the differences in the rate of return. Then the question is, why would anyone buy T-bill? Why would anyone buy bond? Right? The reason is because T-bill and the bonds are safer, and T-bill is safer than bond, and bond is safer than the stock, right? So what explains the differences in the total return? The first one is the maturity premium. So we talked about interest rate risk, right? The asset with the longer duration is riskier. And because of that, they demand higher rate of return. And in case of stock, it is basically a perpetual security, right? It doesn't have a maturity. So that's the reason why stock is riskier. Another one is the risk premium, right? What happens if the issuer has a financial trouble, right? And so this risk is related to the default risk or the risk related to the possible fluctuations in the price. Okay. So what we have to talk about is the concept of the risk, right? What is risk? How can it be measured, right? Can anyone tell me exactly how we measure the risk of a financial asset? Do you guys remember? Let's start from here. How do we measure the rate of return of a financial asset? we learn things like, the internal rate of return, yield, and so on and so forth, right? So it basically is future cash flow that a financial asset can generate minus your purchase price over the purchase price is the rate of return, right? Then how do we measure the risk? The risk is the variance. Actually, I have to raise this. So it's the variance of the rate of return. So we have to calculate the rate of return first, and then we have to calculate the variations in the rate of return. So that's how we calculate the risk. And standard deviation is simply the square root of the variance. Okay, so going back, risk of a financial asset is the variance of the rate of return. Okay. You can use either the variance or standard deviation because they are obviously, they have a linear correlation. Okay, and this is the reason why the statistics is required course for the finance minor, right? So for example, let's say there is an asset, right? And this is a coin toss game. So you flip a coin and you get this return and you get the average return and you calculate the deviations from the actual return. And when you calculate the square deviations, right? Average of that square deviation is the variance, right? So now I want you to go to the Moodle and download a Excel file that is in, I think, topic number 4. So when you go to the topic number 4, there is a portfolio theory Excel. And please download it. Okay. Then you will see this. So we can start from here. Okay. So this is the same Excel file that we covered in the financial markets class. So let's refresh our memories on how to calculate the expected return, how to calculate the risk, how to calculate the relationship between the two, and so on, right? So the numbers that you see here is the first one that you see is the rate of return. So when you buy a stock of an automobile company, so the reason why I picked automobile is because this is an example of a durable good. Right? Durable goods are really known to be pro-cyclical. So when there is an economic boom, demand for durable goods really go up. So car companies usually do really, really well during the boom. So their rate of return, if you had invested in the stocks of automobile companies during the boom, price will go up, and because of that, you will enjoy high return. During the recession, usually they do terribly, right? So we are looking at a stock of a durable goods company, right? So this is a pro-cyclical stock, right? And we are looking at an uncertain asset. which means that the rate of return of that asset really depends on the probability, right? And because we don't know what's going to happen, we are assuming that the probability for each event to happen is exactly 1/3. Okay. In case of the gold, it's the opposite. So this is an example of counter-cyclical asset. So this is a kind of asset that does well when there is an economic recession and does poorly when there is an economic boom, right? So when you have these two different assets, how do you calculate the rate of return of each asset and the risk of each asset? So when you click the next tab, right, we can easily calculate the expected return, right? So the expected return is simply the weighted average of the rate of return for each possible case, right? So the key here is that this is the weighted average of returns. And the weight is the probability for any event to happen. So probability is used as a weight in this case, right? So the expected return is 1/3 of -8 plus 1/3 of 5 plus the 1/3 of 18, right? So in case of a automobile, the expected return is 5%. Then the question is, how do we measure the risk of a financial asset? The risk, as I told you, is the variance of the asset, right? The variance of the rate of return of the asset. So what we have to do is that, we obviously have to calculate the expected return first. Then we calculate the deviation, which is the difference between the actual return and the expected return. And then calculate the squared value of the deviation, right? Then we calculate the weighted average of the squared deviation. So the key here is that variance is weighted average of the squared deviation. Okay, so that's how we calculate the variance. And once we calculate the variance, square root of that variance is the standard deviation. So we use this as a measure of risk of an asset, right? So this is the expected return. This is the risk. Okay, so expected return of auto stock is 5%. Risk is at 10.61%. Okay, and we can do the same thing for the gold, right? And in case of the gold, expected return is only 1%, and the standard deviation is 16.39. Okay, so you can easily say that gold is a terrible investment, right? Because we believe that people are risk averse, which means that people appreciate the return, but people do not appreciate the risk, right? When all the other things are the same, people will actually prefer an asset that has a smaller risk than the other, right? So that's what it means to be a risk-averse investor. Can anyone tell me what it means to be a risk neutral? You can use either chat or you can just turn on your video. Anyone?
Is it you don't care regardless if you lose or if you gain?
I think people will actually care whether they will actually lose or gain, right? Regardless of their risk preference.
Would you just pick the stock that has a better return regardless of risk?
Right, I think that's the right way to put it, right? So people will still care whether they will actually make money or lose money, but before they actually make the purchase, the question is whether they will pay attention to the risk or not. So in case of the risk neutral investor, they will pay attention to the expected value, but they are not going to pay attention to the risk, right? So in this case, if you are a risk neutral investor, which one would you pick? Auto stock or gold? If you're a risk neutral investor, you will just pay attention to the expected return. So obviously the expected return of auto is greater, so you will actually prefer auto to the gold, right? If you are risk averse, you will prefer auto even more, right? Because even if the rate of return of auto and gold are the same, because gold is riskier, if you are a risk averse investor, you will actually prefer auto to gold, right? Are you guys with me so far? Okay. Now, then the question is, why would anyone in that case buy gold? Historically, the rate of return of the gold is really terrible. The historical price of the gold has been, secular downward slope for a long time. And there is a huge fluctuation in the price of the gold. So there is no reason for any risk-averse investor or even the risk-neutral investor to invest in the gold. But many people actually buy gold. Many portfolios have actually a certain share of gold in them. So why?
You can use it to like hedge against market downturns.
That's right. Right. So how does that work? So why would anyone buy an asset that has lower return and greater risk? And how does this asset actually affect the return and the risk of a portfolio? And how does investing in this kind of asset becomes a hedge against an economic downturn?
Does it have something to do with like you can liquidate it quicker than other assets?
Is it really about the liquidity? I think most stocks are more liquid than gold, right? You can easily buy and sell stocks, but if you want to buy gold, where do you go? If you want to especially sell the gold, where do you go?
Not sure.
Right? So the key point here is there's a difference between risk and return of an asset versus risk and return of a portfolio, right? So let's say you created a portfolio and your portfolio has multiple assets, right? Then how do you calculate the rate of return of a portfolio and the risk of a portfolio? Right? Do you guys remember learning a little bit about diversification? in the financial markets class? Right? Diversification means that when you spread your portfolio to many different assets, right, then the risk of your portfolio may actually decrease. And how much the risk of your portfolio decrease depends on the connection between the two assets in your portfolio. So what I'm trying to say is this. Let's first think about the single asset case. In case of single asset, return is weighted average of the possible rate of returns, right? And in this case, the weight is the probability for each event to happen, right? And what is the risk? Risk is standard deviation of the rate of returns. Right? So this is the rate return, the risk of a single asset. Okay. Then how about the portfolio? How do we calculate the rate of return of a portfolio? And how do we calculate the risk of a portfolio? Right. You guys remember how we calculated the rate of return of a portfolio? Let's go to the Excel file. Okay, so when you tab sheet number 3, okay, now you see a portfolio, right? So this is the portfolio weight, right? So this is the, now we are assuming that you are creating a portfolio using auto stock and the gold, right? So now you are investing a portfolio based on these two underlying assets. And this is the share of auto asset, auto stock in your portfolio. So you spend 3/4 of your money buying auto stock and 1/3 of your money, 1/4 of your money in gold, right? In that case, what is the rate of return of your portfolio? What is the risk of your portfolio, right? In case of the rate of return, it's pretty simple. Rate of return is just the weighted average of the rate of return of each asset. Okay, so going back. Portfolio rate of return. In this case, this is weighted average of rate of returns of each asset. In the portfolio. And in this case, the weight is not the probability, it's the share of each asset. Okay, so going back. we spend 3/4 of our money to buy auto stock and 1/4 of our money to buy gold, right? So what is the expected rate of return of the portfolio? So 3/4 times the return of the auto plus 1/4 times the return of the gold, right? And that's the reason why the expected return of the portfolio is 4%. So it's basically 3/4 times 5% plus 1/4 times 1%. Okay, so to summarize, when you have a portfolio, the rate of return of your portfolio is equal to the weighted average of the rate of return of each asset in your portfolio. Okay, now that's not that difficult. The problem is the risk. What is the risk of a portfolio? The risk of a portfolio depends on three things, right? The share of each asset in your portfolio, right? This. And second thing is the risk of each asset, which is this, right? And there is a third thing, which is the correlation between the two assets. Okay, so when we go here, okay, let's say you invested in 3 different stocks, IBM, Starbucks, and Walmart, right? Weight of each asset is 50%, 25%, and 25%. So you put half of your money in IBM, 1/4 of your money in Starbucks, the other 1/4 in Walmart. The rate of return of each asset is 8.3%, 12.5%, 4.7%, right? Then what is the rate of return? The rate of return is just a weighted average, right? It's a 0.5 times 8.3 plus 0.25 times 12.5 plus 0.25 times 4.7. So it's an 8.45%, right? How about the risk? The risk depends on the risk of each asset, weight of each asset, but also depends on correlation coefficient between each of these assets. Okay, so let's go back to the Excel file. Okay, so in this case, when you look at the standard deviation of the return, variance of the return, right? What we did here is that we calculated the variance of your portfolio return here, okay? And this actually depends on the share of each asset, risk of each asset, and the correlation coefficient between the two assets, right? So two assets A and B, right? And this is the rate of return of A, right? And this is the risk of A, standard deviation of A, rate of return of B, risk of B. P is the share of A in your portfolio. Then when you think about the risk of your portfolio, no, not this one. Risk of your portfolio, right, is share of each asset, which is P. So this is how we calculate the risk of a portfolio. So what it means is that risk of your portfolio depends on share of each asset in your portfolio, risk of each asset. And this is covariance between A and B. Okay, so the risk of your portfolio depends on risk of each asset in your portfolio, share of each asset in your portfolio, and how these two assets are correlated, captured by the covariance between the two. Okay, and this can be rewritten as and here, this is correlation coefficient. Yeah, so this is the annoying part, right? So do you guys remember the properties of the expected value and the properties of the variance that you learned in the econometrics class or stats class? So it comes from that. So this is, as Max said, this is the most annoying part, right? So it'll be really, really nice that if the risk of an asset, risk of a portfolio is simply the weighted average of the risk of each asset in your portfolio, right? But in the case of the risk of the portfolio is weighted average of the risk of each asset in your portfolio plus the correlation between the two assets, right? So if two assets are inversely correlated, so going back here, right? If two assets are inversely correlated, right? When one does well, the other doesn't do well, then the correlation coefficient will have a negative value, right? And this is positive, but this will become negative. So what it means is that when you invest in two assets that are inversely correlated, then the risk of your portfolio will actually go down given the risk of each asset. Okay, so risk of your portfolio depends not only on the risk of each asset, but also on how two assets are correlated. Okay, so that's the difference between the return and the risk of a single asset versus the return and risk of a portfolio. So in case of a portfolio, right, the risk of a portfolio depends not only on the risk of each asset, but also how two assets are correlated. Okay. Any questions about this one? let's go back to here. What determines the risk of a portfolio, right? So this is not as simple as this one. So risk of a portfolio depends on risk of each asset, share of each asset, and correlations correlation coefficient of assets in your portfolio, right? So this becomes really important. Okay. So that's the reason why when you actually go back to the PowerPoint, right? That's the reason why whenever we talk about a portfolio management, it talks about the diversification, right? So when you diversify your investment, when you diversify your portfolio across the assets that are either not correlated with each other, so in that case, the correlation coefficient will be 0, or that are inversely correlated, in that case, the correlation coefficient will be negative, then by diversifying your investment across assets that are inversely correlated, you can actually reduce the risk of your portfolio. And it can be, at some point, safer than each asset in your portfolio, right? So that's the magic of diversification. Okay. All right. Now, to illustrate that point, let's go back to the Excel. Now, do you guys see the Excel file? Okay. Now, let me actually enlarge this. So now we have two assets, P and Q, right? And this is the rate of return. So P is an asset that has 12% return and 8% standard deviation. Okay, and Q is an asset that has 8% return and 5% standard deviation. So Q is an asset that is safer, but has a low return. P is an asset that has high return, but higher risk than the asset P. The chart that you see here has a two planes, right? So the horizontal axis is the risk, and the vertical axis is the return. Okay, so as we move to the right, the risk of asset increases, right? So obviously asset P is to the right of the asset Q, which means that asset P is riskier than asset Q, right? And the vertical axis is the rate of return. And obviously P is higher than Q, means that P also has a higher return than Q. Are you guys with me so far? Okay. Oh. I will finish this up in 5 minutes. So now what I'm trying to show you is this is the correlation coefficient, right? And all these dots that connects this P and the Q is the rate of return and the risk combination of a portfolio. right? So when you put all of your money in asset P, you'll be here. When you put all of your money in asset Q, you will be here. If you put half of your money in asset P and half of your money in asset Q, you'll be around here. Okay, and the return and the risk of your portfolio depends on the shape of this curve. Okay, and how this curve is shaped depends on the correlation coefficient between the two. Right now, correlation coefficient is 0, which means that these two assets are independent of each other. Whatever happens in asset P doesn't affect the return in asset Q, right? See what happens when the correlation coefficient becomes negative. Oops. What do you see here? The curve shifts to the left, right? So curve was here before. Then now curve kind of shifted to the left. Think about what it means. What it means is that because the horizontal axis is the risk, what it means is that when you enjoy the same rate of return, right, you can actually reduce the risk. And the extreme case is when two assets have perfectly negative correlation. Right? Then now, you can actually enjoy 9.5% return with 0 risk. Right? Now, you can create a portfolio out of 2 risky assets. Right? But that portfolio will have the risk level of 0. And that's possible because the assets in your portfolio are negatively and perfectly correlated, right? So this is the benefit of diversification. So when you have 2 assets that are inversely correlated, depending on how strongly they are inversely correlated, it is possible for you to create a portfolio that can minimize the risk while enjoying the same level of return. And this illustrates the benefit of diversification. So the benefit of diversification really depends on the correlation coefficient between the 2 assets. Okay. Any questions so far? All right, that's it for today. I know that it's a lot, so I think it's really, really important for you to actually read the chapter 11 carefully. And also, if you have a chance, go to the capital asset pricing model and start reading it. And also go to the Moodle and download the problem set and start working on that problem set. And it's due by next Thursday. So we will go over some of the questions together, and we will hopefully be able to cover this entire capital asset pricing model by next Thursday. Okay. Any questions? All right. That's it, guys, today. And stay safe.